Now a discussion on efforts to ensure Homeland security while protecting personal liberties. Officials from the Office of Homeland Security and the American Civil Liberties Union debated the issues at this forum hosted by the Close-Up Foundation. It's about an hour.
Hello and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Milewski of the Close-Up Foundation. I want to welcome you to part 2 of our multi-part series in collaboration with the Wilson Center, where we've been exploring the world post 9/11. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of how safe is too safe as it relates to domestic security concerns and also concerns about American civil liberties. Joining us, as he always does, is the co-host of our Close-Up at the Wilson series. He is the executive producer and host of Dialogue, Mr. George Seay. George, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you back here, John, as always.
Thanks, George. George, a logical progression in our discussion.
Much so.
We looked at the international scene post 9/11, and now we turn our attention to things back here at home. Give us your read on how this debate starts to break down.
Well, it's certainly a very important debate, John, maybe the most important we have in the country right now. And the way I think of it is this. We, as Americans, have gotten very used to the idea that we pay a high price for freedom. I mean, there are veteran cemeteries all over the world that document that fact. And I think since September 11th, we've been learning that you have to pay a high price for security as well. But that, as Americans, poses a very important question to us, given the nature of our country. And to wit, it is, does feeling safe necessarily come at the cost of being free? Or to put it perhaps more elegantly, how can we preserve the civil liberties that we cherish and that are really such an important part of our country and gain the national security that we absolutely must have?
Immediately following the attacks, there seemed to be a lot of tolerance for inconvenience as it relates to safety procedures, and now the cracks are starting to show. People are starting to challenge.
I think so, and in a good way. I mean, I find that there's certainly a continuing, in my opinion, very high-level concern with security. We all have that. But as Americans, we are just born question askers, and so questions are being asked about what works and what doesn't work, and you know, how much security comes at the cost of how much freedom.
Well, we'll get into some of those questions today. Let me introduce you and our students to our guests. Richard Falkenrath is Senior Director of Policy and Plans for the Office of Homeland Security. He's also an Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he's co-author of the book, America's Achilles Heel, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Terrorism and Covert Attack. Also with us, Gregory Nojeim is Associate Director of the Washington, D.C. Office for the American Civil Liberties Union. He previously served as the ACLU's Legislative Counsel. He has testified before Congress about the civil liberties implications of anti-terrorism and anti-militia legislation. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you.
One of Mr. Nojeim's colleagues, Anthony Romero at the ACLU, had this to say. He said, 6 months after 9/11, much has fundamentally changed. Perhaps the most disturbing change is the government's apparent dismissal of the idea that our society can and must be both safe and free. I'm guessing you don't agree with that statement, but could you give us your read on where these tensions are at this stage in the game?
Oh, I don't know what the basis for that statement is. I think we don't dismiss that idea at all. In fact, we embrace it. Freedom is part of the American way of life. It is something that we're absolutely committed to protecting and maintaining, and we think we can do that at the same time as we build a more secure homeland. So I don't know what the basis for this of that claim is.
Where are the areas, though, that are the most challenging in this regard when you're trying to maintain the level of freedom Americans are used to, but also secure a system with lots of holes?
I think they have to do mainly with electronic surveillance of potential threats operating within the United States, and that raises extremely difficult civil liberties questions. But I think it's important to recognize that Homeland Security involves many more things than electronic surveillance of potential terrorists operating here in America. It involves better border security, better emergency services, better health systems, addressing our intelligence community to make sure that we have good information on foreign threats, getting our incident management systems in shape, so that if there is an attack, we can respond effectively, making sure we have interoperable communication so that all the different public safety agencies that come together, that can talk to one another, work together. We've got a lot of other things besides electronic surveillance of potential terrorists that are Homeland Security. So I don't think we should overstate the severity of that conflict or that tension.
Rich, I like that shopping list of items that are important. I fully agree they are. And I think you would agree also that communications is a big part of that with the American public as to what is important and what should be done. And in that vein, and this is almost a personal curiosity, there's this ongoing controversy about Director Ridge not addressing Congress on this, and it might be good if you told us why, or what his reasons were for not taking that stance.
You're right, this is a controversy. We're in it right now. There's a very strong feeling on the Hill that he should testify. The position of the administration of the president is that he will not testify because he is an advisor to the president. His formal position is assistant to the president for national security affairs. And the individuals who have held that title traditionally have been very close to the president, offer him confidential advice, and have not been subject to sworn testimony before the cameras on the Hill. This is not to say that we don't believe that Congress has an extremely important role in Homeland Security. We have spent a lot of time with the Congress, both the members and the staff. Governor Ridge is there very often, his staff is there very often, and other members of the administration are. So there's a difference of opinion, and it's being addressed as we speak.
The job you described is obviously a massive undertaking. How far along do you feel you are in getting to the point where you're confident that all of the channels of communication that need to be established have been established?
It's hard to answer that. We have a lot of work to do, but we think that we've done a very great deal since September 11th. Now remember, the Office of Homeland Security per se only came into existence in early October. But we think we've made a lot of progress on a lot of different fronts. We've sent a budget to the Hill for the fiscal year 2003 that contains a number of very important initiatives that fully funds a great deal of federal activity to help secure the homeland. We have excellent working relationships with state public safety leaders and local public safety leaders. We're growing them with the private sector. Every federal agency has Homeland Security activities that it is addressing and working with their constituent groups. We have a public outreach effort. My presence here is part of that, but we are meeting literally every day. Members of the administration are meeting with citizens groups, interest groups, concerned about the security of the homeland. So I can't give you a sense how far along we are, but I can say that in the last 5 months, last 6 months, the government has done a very great deal.
Gregory, get back to the quote from your colleague, Mr. Romero. What specifically was the ACLU making reference to when it addressed this concern?
We have only a handful, really, of bulwarks of freedom in our country. One of those aspects of our freedom is the separation of powers. It really keeps the different branches of government in check. And we're very concerned about some of the efforts that the administration has made that erode some of those protections. For example, in the electronic surveillance area, about which you were discussing earlier, there's a question about the degree to which judges will be involved when the government seeks to listen in on a conversation. We think that judges should play a role, and a big role, and that they ought to be able to be given the chance to review an application, decide whether there's what's known as probable cause of crime before, for example, the government can monitor where a person is going on the internet, what sites they visited. And the legislation that Congress passed doesn't include that protection. So we're very concerned about that. Another of the bulwarks of freedom is openness. And really, we've had an open society, and it's worked very well for us. We have a strong Freedom of Information Act, and yet some of the actions that the administration has taken have gone against that, have increased secrecy in ways that aren't really necessary to protect freedom or to protect security.
Do you have a specific example of that case where you think the government has kept a secret it didn't need to?
Yes. First, what the Attorney General did, and this I understand was pre-9/11, the decision was made pre-9/11, was he basically reversed the underlying premise of the Freedom of Information Act, which is a presumption of openness, that the government would share information with people. What he said under the previous Attorney General, the rule was that information that there was discretion to hold back wouldn't be released unless harm could be shown. What the Attorney General did was take that away and say that information ought to be withheld if there was a reasonable legal basis for doing that. So that's one of the aspects. Another of the things that's happened recently is the takedown of information from websites, government websites. For example, if a person wants to know whether the chemical plant down the street in their neighborhood is storing chemicals that might be dangerous to them if they were released, well, the government is now saying, I think we have to take that down because we're worried that terrorists would get it. Well, what about me? I want to know if that plant down the street poses a danger and whether there are different chemicals that would do the job that these dangerous ones have. That kind of information is being taken down.
That certainly gets to the heart of the kind of trade-offs that we want to talk about, though. Are you concerned that an al-Qaeda member or some other group that would wish ill will against us would have access to that information?
I am concerned. I am concerned. But the reality is that we have to make these tough choices. We have to balance things. And we can't have a society where information that's important for people to use to protect themselves and to demand changes is taken down because we fear other things. Look, terrorists use roads too. No one would say close the roads so the terrorists can't use them. I mean, there are limits, and we have to explore these as a society. We have to make balances, and we have to do what works and yet keeps us free.
I find that very appealing and compelling, Gregory. But I guess when you compare information and roads, I'm a little at a loss, because it does seem to me that we are, or would you accept the notion that we are in extraordinary circumstances, and finding out where that balance is between what can be withheld and what can be released is a very delicate art. I mean, clearly, I would want access to as much information as possible. But in these very charged circumstances, if there's a possibility that something may be of use to terrorists that is not vital to me, then my interest is less.
I think that that's true. I also think, though, that we're not necessarily in a temporary situation. We're going to have this threat for a long, long time. The president said it. I think it's reasonable to believe that what we're talking about today are changes that could well be permanent, or at least last for the lifetime of you and I and even the people in the audience.
I think we agree on that point. This is, we should treat the terrorist threat as more or less a permanent condition at this point, and assume that this is the reality of life in the 21st century. And if we can change that, we will, and we hope to be able to do that. But for purposes of planning assumptions, we often have that in mind. This notion about the information on the internet that is being taken down from government websites, other kinds of websites, these issues are looked at carefully before those decisions are made. And in many cases, the federal agencies in charge of doing this are establishing other procedures through which interest groups with a genuine right to know can get access to the information. But let me just say, this is not an academic hypothesis whether the terrorists use internet information for targeting purposes. We know with certain knowledge that they do. When you know that, and when you see the evidence, you have a different view about the importance of getting information that could be used to kill American citizens off of the easiest modes of acquisition, which are, of course, the internet.
You know, that's interesting also, Rich. Could I call the situation we're entering now permanent code yellow? I mean, to use we
wouldn't have established the tiers if we didn't expect some movement among them.
Mm-hmm. But it's going to be a high level of alert for a long, long time. Right.
Well, you know, in our last discussion, George, if you recall, Jim Woolsey was asked the question, how long will this situation last? And he said, longer than World War II, shorter than the Cold War. 10, 20, 30 years was his guess. We had a general from Pakistan here who nodded in agreement.
Yeah, but that's the point, though. But in those circumstances, doesn't the question of oversight become extremely important? I mean, in the abstract, I can accept that, you know, the right people will be making those decisions, but there's no determination that they're making the right decisions, is there? And I mean, if we go on and on in this way without that kind of control, we're in very, very different terrain for Americans.
But, I mean, you're not suggesting there's no oversight. There's a very great deal of oversight. I mean, our government is a system of separate institutions sharing powers, and everyone's powers are limited. There are very few powers that any particular office within any branch of the federal government can exercise unilaterally without someone else checking it in some way, either the judiciary, the legislature, or the executive.
Well, like the decision on who takes down stuff off the internet. I mean, who reviews that decision?
I mean, it depends on the specifics of the case. In some cases, it's a statutory matter, which might need to get adjudicated, take to the courts to have them decide it. In other cases, it would be within the administrative authorities of the federal agency in question.
Well, let's make it clear. I mean, what's happened is the agencies in question have taken down information, and there's been no additional legislation requiring them. There's been no action except the act of those people seeking who control the information. So that's one of the unilateral things that's happened. And I think it's important that we, as a society, recognize the strength that the separation of powers gives us, and that we use that to preserve our freedoms. And it makes sense to me to have members of the executive branch come up in front of Congress, explain what they're doing. Now, I don't know that it has to be Mr. Ridge or not, but certainly people who are in the know, who can explain to Congress what's been asked for, where the money will be used, and really prove that some of the measures that are taken, particularly ones that will affect civil liberties, prove that they're going to work. We ought to be demanding proof before we give up freedoms. I mean, let's do a two-tier analysis. The first question is it going to be effective? And the second one is it worth it in terms of dollars and in terms of any freedom we'd have to give up?
Well, that is the million-dollar question here, isn't it? And these are questions that won't only define your next hour as you ask them, but we're going to define the formative and prime years of your life, according to all the guesses that all of our guests have had on how long this situation is going to last. Hi.
Hi, I'm Corey from Minnesota, and I'm wondering, since 9/11, terrorists and terrorism has become aware to Americans, and it is now being taken very seriously. It has been proposed that terrorists on death row will have less time to appeal the court's decision than other death row inmates. I was wondering, how do you feel about this, and what do you think the government's level of interest is in this topic?
Corey, do you have an opinion before we get an answer for you?
I think they should be taken just like any other death row inmates, because obviously if you're on death row, you've been sentenced to death, so you should be taken the same either way.
Same protections, okay.
I'm not aware of that proposal.
Well, I don't think we should be taking shortcuts with people on death row in particular. Look, we've been around, this country's been around for more than 200 years. We've got procedures that we follow. They work. And you know what? If there's a person on death row who's innocent, and we execute him, that person obviously has suffered a terrible harm. But you know what else? If you execute a person who's accused of being a terrorist and who really wasn't, we all suffer, because that means that the terrorist is still out there running free and an innocent person has been executed. So I don't think we should be looking at shortcuts now. We have to be very careful.
Okay,
Is there a distinction to be made here between a war criminal and a criminal charged under normal laws of the United States government?
Well, look at what we're talking about here. The president issued an order to set up these military tribunals. He could have issued an order that covered only people captured on the battlefields of Afghanistan. Instead, he issued an order that could apply to any non-citizen in the United States who he believes is involved in terrorism. This is about one person deciding who has constitutional rights and who doesn't, who gets a trial by jury and who doesn't.
If his choice had been more limited to those apprehended on the battlefield in Afghanistan, would that have been an acceptable standard for you?
You know, we would have been interested in seeing an order that was more limited. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We have to live with what was given, and that's what we're doing.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. Whitney Bostick from Alaska. Do any of you think that the United States was too lenient or relaxed on our homeland security before September 11th?
What do you think, Wendy?
Compared to what it is now, I think that we, especially in the airports, we're extremely relaxed. I mean, I feel much safer now, even though I have to leave my parents before I reach my gate. But I feel more safer in the airport knowing that the only people in there are the ones with tickets or not actually going somewhere.
I, as an academic, wrote a book calling for a large number of new initiatives, proposals, that sort of thing. So clearly, as an academic, I had felt like there was a lot more that needed to be done. I don't think it's fair to suggest that the federal government or anyone didn't take terrorism very seriously before 9/11. But now, looking back, we see a very large amount of work that needs to be done to improve our ability to detect terrorists before they hit, to apprehend them before they attack, to deter them, and then to respond effectively if they do carry out their attacks. So we have a lot of work to do. Pre 9/11, there was some work going on. I think post 9/11, you look back and you say, there's a lot more we need to do.
I'm sorry, George, go ahead.
A quick question to you, Rich. To accomplish that very large agenda, I know that the Director Ridge has advocated more consolidation among agencies, and I read today that the INS and Customs might be joined. Will that go far enough, or do you need the full agenda, the full slate of more agencies combined under the same mandate?
I think what we need to do is look at the structure of government as a whole for providing for Homeland Security. When you do that, you see a lot of overlap and a lot of redundancy between the different agencies. And, there are no other proposals or ideas under consideration at the moment, but we certainly don't rule them out. If you're providing a service, for example, providing special equipment and training to firefighters out in America's cities, you don't need 2 or 3 different federal programs in different cabinet agencies doing that. You need just one that does it well and that has the right economy of scale and can implement a large program effectively so that the local governments have a single point of contact. You don't need multiple. So the President's budget for 2003 proposes a consolidation of that effort into the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Whitney, I know this is a very difficult question to answer, but you said now that you're willing to leave your parents early at the airport and to stand in longer lines, whatever it is you're willing to do. Do you think you would have been willing to do that prior to the attacks of September 11th? I mean, is it easy to say now, in 2020 hindsight, that you would take on these inconveniences? Would you have been willing to do it before then?
I think I would, but as you said, it's kind of easier to look back now and see
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get at here is when people are second-guessing whether security was tight enough, I think part of what we have to honestly answer is whether we would have accepted tighter security without the sense of a real threat.
I went on an international flight before September 11th, and I had to leave my parents there, and it wasn't as big as a thing to me because, we still stood until the last possible moment before I had to go down to my gate. And I was okay with that because, you can call them once you get there. And I think we should be willing to stand in lines longer as long as it's for our safety. We shouldn't be risking our safety just to get to somewhere faster. We're always worried about time, and I think we need to realize that it's our lives that are on the line.
Whitney, could I ask you a question? There's a new machine that they're testing in the airport in Orlando. And you walk up to this machine, and it can literally look under your clothes and project an image of your naked body on a screen for other people to see. They're testing another machine too. This one puffs a whiff of air at you, and inside this machine there are detectors that can determine whether you've been around a plastic explosive recently. If somebody told you that you had the choice to use the first machine, they had the choice to use the first machine, which projects an image of your naked body, or the second machine, which sniffs, would that be a choice that which choice would you make?
Well, as any teenage girl, body is kind of difficult to handle. I would be willing to go through both of them as long as I know I wouldn't be criticized on what I looked like on the screen.
In the interest of fairness, I think we need to hear from a teenage boy on this question. Not necessarily.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the point you were making.
The point I'm trying to make is that sometimes we have choices. If it can be shown that the two machines work equally well at doing the job, or that we can minimize the use or eliminate the use of the one that's particularly intrusive, let's go with the one that's not so intrusive. Let's go with the one that doesn't require us to bear all in order to get on an airplane.
Literally.
Okay. Hi.
Yes, I'm Sean Holland from Alaska. I've heard the relationship between civil liberties and national security often compared to a game of chess, that in order to win the whole game, we have to sacrifice a pawn or a bishop. Do you think that this is necessary in wartime as long as that pawn or bishop is returned at the end of the game?
I don't think it's a good metaphor. I mean, I think we have national security to protect our people and our way of life, which includes the freedoms we hold dear. That's what we're trying to protect with our security apparatus. Now, there are very difficult issues raised when you start talking about internal threats, the sort of clandestine infiltration of our society by a terrorist network. Raises very hard questions, just as espionage threats in earlier eras raised very hard questions about civil liberties. And so I don't think it's right to think of it as a chess game where the two are competing against the other. But when you are trying to defend your society and your way of life against an external threat, and that external threat decides to come inside and try to disguise itself and make it look just like part of everything else, then you're in really difficult terrain, and you need to tread very carefully. But you also need to be pretty purposeful when you're dealing with a threat capable of really mass destruction like we saw on September 11.
Go ahead, please.
My name is Melissa Nelson. I'm from Alaska. Do you believe that the Patriot Acts were put into place maybe under the wrong emotions or maybe too soon? And if so, when it would have been the appropriate time to act upon this?
I think that it wasn't a question of being too soon. I think it was a question of whether to do a lot of what was in the Patriot Act or not. Because some of what's in the Patriot Act is very dangerous. For example, we've had a process here in the United States of having notice when the government searches a person's home. You've seen it on TV. They knock on the door, they say, "We're the FBI, we're here with a warrant." And they give notice. The Patriot Act, among many of the provisions it has, includes one that allows for more secret searches so that the government could, with a court order, but they could, break into a person's home, search, look at what they had on their computer, read the documents on their computer, and the person wouldn't be notified in a timely way. And in some cases, with intelligence searches, there's never a notification. So there were a lot of things in the bill that I think we have to acknowledge would increase safety and would not have an adverse impact on civil liberties. Those are fine. But there are other provisions, like the one I just described, that I think really don't have a place in a bill at any time.
Let me go to that very point, though, Gregory. The example you cited, isn't the essential control the obtaining of a court order? I mean, to me, the puzzle of the moment is that we live in what I still consider, I'm sure we all do, extremely extraordinary circumstances in which the enemy is largely invisible, and it is an enemy, and they are very active and very determined. And so a clandestine or secret search may be in some ways necessary, but a court order would be the control. But you're still bothered.
I am. The court order is very important control. We need to maintain court orders. I mean, that's kind of fundamental. But openness is also important.
But how open can you be when you're facing this kind of threat? I mean, there can be circumstances where I would think that openness might be another concession to the worst outcome.
No, I think that we have to be very careful here, really. What we're talking about is whether we want to live in a country where the government can secretly break into people's homes and conduct a search.
With a court order. With
a court order. I think that it's important that people get notice. Because how can you defend yourself? And in some cases, when they approach your home and the court order says it's 602 Main Street and you live in 600 Main Street, and the court order says they're looking for a thing that couldn't possibly fit in your home, I mean, at least you get a chance to say, you've got the wrong home, you've got the wrong person, and you need to go to the right place. But when it's done secretly, there's really no way to protect your rights.
I want to, before we come to your question, briefly revisit the rejected chess metaphor, if I could, from the civil libertarian's point of view. The point the student made about, are you willing to make trade-offs in a temporary manner? I'm just trying to get a read from you on, is there something you're willing to give up during an acute circumstance that risks trampling on civil liberties or at least lessening civil liberties for a period of time? These law enforcement officials have a very difficult job to do. And as we all know, it's impossible to create a foolproof system where nothing can slip through the net. Now, I understand the two-point test that you've put on the table. Is it worth it? Point two is where you might come down on this, but I'm just trying to get some sense. Is there any area in which you're willing to allow more latitude during an acute circumstance?
First, I acknowledge, and we have acknowledged from the beginning, that law enforcement has a very difficult job. We have an important job, too, which is to protect constitutional rights in a difficult situation. And what we just established was that this situation is going to last for a few decades. Let's acknowledge that. Let's put that on the table. Let's understand that what we're talking about are possibly long-term changes. And so, you know, if we were talking about a few days, it might be one thing.
Well, let me frame it as a specific, rather than because it's difficult to talk in general terms. An issue that has been discussed that I'm sure you've all encountered in your trip here to Washington is random checks at airports, where we've seen members of Congress with fake hips being have their pants dropped, 85-year-old nuns searched, and we've all seen it firsthand if we've been on an airplane since 9/11. And the argument is, look, we know these people aren't risks. What are we trying to prove? And a lot of it has been to avoid charges of invading people's civil liberties by doing any type of profiling. What is your position on the most effective way? Because one of the concerns, Charles Krauthammer wrote a column on this in the Washington Post, is that while you're spending time having your grandmother strip searched, there could be some more dangerous person getting on that aircraft, and you can't check everybody going on.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a difficult dilemma. It really is. The reality is that no profile can look inside a person's heart and determine whether that person is going to do something dangerous to the airplane and the people on it. You just don't know.
Are you saying that any passenger is equally a threat on an aircraft?
I'm saying that if you so focus on that handful that fit the profile, and if you do it in a way that is discriminatory, you pick people out who are Arabs or Muslims or South Asians, I think that's wrong. And I also think it's not going to be effective. Because if that's what you're doing, you know, the next bomber is not going to look like that.
Look,
they're going to have someone
there's certain kinds of profiling
who will do the job who doesn't fit the profile.
There's certain kinds of profiling which are inappropriate and not going to be done. But we need to be clear that providing security for our society there's so much traffic and movement of people and goods and vehicles within our society and into our country from the outside that there's no way that we could just randomly search everything that comes through or even try to get it all. It's out of the question. So what you need to do is some sort of risk management scheme where you use information when you can get it in an appropriate fashion to focus in on a certain segment of the traffic which is higher risk for whatever reason, based on whatever analysis that you can do, and it will vary and it will not be perfect, so that the vast majority of the traffic, which is low risk, can move through just without any trouble or with very short delays. We're trying to apply this now on our borders, where we inspect something like 2% of the cargo containers that come into this country. And the key is not, the objective for trying to secure the country is not to get 2% up to 20%. The key is to make sure that that 2% is as targeted on the highest risk traffic as we can. And what that will generally mean are containers that didn't come from a big company with which we have an established trading relationship, that the provenance is unknown or whatever. And that same basic principle is the only way to manage the huge amount of traffic that we've got to worry about. I mean, what happened on 9/11 was there was a failure of airline security, of airplane security, that actually that caused the worst terrorist disaster in history. Now, it might not have been a failure in the sense that you know, it was permissible at the time to come onto those aircraft with the things that they came onto them with. But what we learned post 9/11 is we cannot afford to have that happen to us again, and we've passed a law, passed by both houses of both chambers in Congress and signed by the President, to establish its mandates in terms of what needs to be done to secure the airline, the transportation sector. And we're in the process, the administration, of implementing that. It's very expensive, it's a very large-scale task, but we're cranking through it. It's in the early stages, and the processes and the procedures will be refined as we go along, but there is a very clear legal requirement to secure airline transportation.
You know, we were profiling before 9/11. And we have a profile we've been using in the airport, the computer-assisted passenger screening system. And it picked up some of the people who are alleged to have flown those airplanes, and it didn't pick up others. 6 years ago, when I was testifying about this very system, I said, this system's going to fail. And when it fails, the people who advocated this profiling system are not going to admit that it failed. What they're going to say is, we need to make it better. We need to add more and more personal information to the mix. We need to make it more intrusive. And that's exactly what's happening today. And it's very troubling. I don't see how one can reliably predict who's going to do this to the airport.
But there has to be a judgment made, doesn't there, Gregory? I mean, there are just so many resources that can be dedicated to counteracting, to keeping bad things from happening, and so you seriously have to make choices as to what probabilities are, and I would think that we're almost compelled to use some kind of standard for that. I would agree, and I hope Rich meant this when he said certain profiling was inappropriate, that you meant profiling based upon ethnic or racial origin. But if there are other factors that can be weighed, I think there's an argument.
But we can't escape the reality of this current circumstance and who the enemy is. And I've yet to see an Al-Qaeda member or Taliban member who didn't fit a certain profile. And I'm not making any, and we're all walking on eggshells here, and I'm going out on a limb because I know in our PC world, you got to be real careful about what you say, and I will stand behind my record of, my personal record of not being a prejudiced person, professionally and privately. But there is a reality that the 19 men who boarded those flights on that fateful day all fit a certain profile, and they weren't elderly congressmen with fake hips.
Go ahead.
Well, very quickly, though, John, you're likely to get an elderly congressman with a fake hip the next time. I mean,
you really think that's the case?
I think that can happen. I think there is that's the reason why I think this whole question of who's likely to do something has to be on a far wider basis than just what someone's ethnic origin is.
You know, if they had been focusing on only ethnic origin, they wouldn't have picked up Richard Reed. Richard Reed was a British citizen, and you know, he didn't fit that Arab, Muslim, or South Asian profile. So I think we have to be very careful here, and we have to think this through.
No disagreements there. I just the question again of, are we willing to take extra steps to secure ourselves, or are we going to pretend, and that's my point of view, and I know it's not about my point of view, that everyone is an equal threat. And in some of the random searches at airports, that's seemingly what's being suggested, that anyone getting on that aircraft is an equal threat, including elderly Congress people with fake hips.
Yes, I'm Blake Binky from Seattle, Washington, and looking at our reaction post 9/11, there's some startling resemblances to the McCarthy era that I find worrisome personally. You're
not talking about me, are you? No, I'm just kidding.
But I think the matter needs to be addressed that in both situations there was a threat, whether it be communists or terrorists, that we saw as a threat to our homeland security. And the reaction in both cases was prompted by fear. And looking back, one may not feel that that was the best decision. And so how, in this situation, as a Homeland Security advisor, are we going to make sure that we're not acting out of fear, but acting out of a safe mind, I guess?
The McCarthy experience tore the country apart, and it tore the executive branch apart. The 9/11 experience and the post-9/11 experience, I think, has brought the country together in a quite remarkable way. And sure, there are issues where there are differences of opinion and disagreement. Electronic surveillance is one, profiling another, that we've talked about a lot. But I think it's important to recognize that the things the nation is doing to better secure itself against the terrorist threat, the bulk of it we are unanimous about. We all agree we need to improve our health system so we can better defend against the threat of bioterrorism. We need to help our first responders, firefighter and police, to respond to terrorism. We need to improve our information sharing systems so that we can get threat information out to the public, to public safety organizations. We need to involve the military in an appropriate way that's right for their role, which is, in fact, rather small in Homeland Security. We're going to rely primarily on civilian agencies to secure. We need to work with the private sector. We need to involve the citizens groups. I see, with the exception of a few issues that are divisive and politically charged, like does Governor Ridge testify, or electronic surveillance standards, or profiling, an incredible coming together. And as we go around and talk about the different initiatives that the administration is putting forward, often with members of the Hill or from state and local government, we are seeing very strong support from these people. So, you know, there are some differences. I don't mean to minimize that, but by and large, I think the country is pulling together around this.
Thanks, Blake. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kristen from Michigan, and I understand that as the war on terrorism continues and we need to worry about safety measures, that our civil rights, our civil liberties may need to be violated in some ways. But if this happens, how do we know where to draw the line, and how will we know that?
Again, that's what we've all been searching
it
for
is,
here.
it is.
And if only we had the answer.
It's difficult to give kind of a blanket answer, and I guess I don't hope to give one. But I'll tell you when you should start worrying. You should start worrying when the people who are not the majority, who are not the strong advocates, who are, who might be poor, who might not be well educated, who might be members of ethnic or racial minority groups, when those people start to get hurt, that's when you should start worrying, because that means that the measures that we're taking are going to start having a broader and broader effect. And I think that we ought to be very careful about that. So I know it's not a complete answer to your question, but
I struggle for a complete answer as well. But the government, and by this I mean the presidency, the executive branch, the courts, the state leaders, they have responsibility to protect the liberties of every American, but also to protect the Americans from external attack by terrorists. And they need to do both. There's no avoiding that. And what often happens is these issues are dealt with case by case, and they're very difficult calls made by people who are not acting unilaterally, who are acting within a framework and who are largely accountable. And we have public interest groups like the ACLU out there watching it and calling attention to things that they don't like. So there is information getting out there for those who have a different opinion. But it's handled on a sort of case-by-case basis, and very difficult calls about very complex issues have to be made on many different areas.
I guess a fairly recent example of going too far would be Japanese internment during World War II, if there's something you want to look at in recent history. It shows how we could go too far.
An excellent example, John. And that just gave me the idea that maybe in addition to, or maybe as a component of Homeland Security, we really need to have a tolerance campaign, for lack of a better word, in our society, because we are a society of immigrants, and that's ever more true. And it seems to me all these things are coming to a head at the same time, and to avoid the kind of bias and bigotry that you're talking about, perhaps getting to understand the complex mosaic nature of this country is as important as anything else we do.
Have you had any tolerance discussions? George, you bring up tolerance, and I know in education circles that's been a hotter word than usual post 9/11. Have you had any of these discussions in your classroom?
We've discussed just amongst ourselves whether we thought certain ethnic backgrounds should be targeted and who we thought, if anyone, should be targeted. But that's about it.
Can I ask for a show of hands of how many of you in your classrooms have had these types of discussions about the current situation and about tolerance as a specific point of how we need to manage this as a nation? Raise your hand if that's been the case.
Oh, that's good.
It looks like just about everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Chanel Evans from Minnesota. In relation to the Patriot Act, Section 105 did not pass through Congress, which is information on foreign governments, from foreign governments. Do you feel because of the time period of the current war we are in that might pass? Will the U.S. be allowed to get information on other U.S. citizens from other foreign governments?
You have the entire document there, you're quoting Section 105. What are you? You've come more prepared than we have today.
You've definitely got more information than I do. I don't know. The Patriot, I can't remember when the Patriot Act passed. I think it was November.
October.
October. It was very early on, and it was passed. Congress considered it. They put in there in their conference, the president signed. Those authorities went into effect. The federal law enforcement agencies who operate under them started adjusting their behavior accordingly. We at the Office of Homeland Security moved on to many different things. It's the rest of the agenda that I talked about initially.
Well, on that, I mean, our government does get a lot of information from foreign governments, information about Americans, too. I think one of the provisions that was in the bill originally that didn't get through, that I'm glad didn't get through, would have allowed foreign governments to participate in wiretaps here in the United States. There is some sharing that happens now, we know that. But look, we have a law enforcement system, we have a court system. We thought that there was no need to involve foreign governments in that particular kind of activity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. My name is Amy, and I'm from Michigan. And in reference to the security measures that are taking place or will be taking place, where do you think the line should be drawn, and how much people should know about it, and what should be kept secret?
Well, we keep coming back to that question, and I think we're going to leave you unsatisfied.
I'm going to
identifying the line.
Talk about one place where I think we've gone over the line on secrecy in particular, and that's in this detention campaign. The government has held more than 1,200 people at one time or another in connection with the September 11th attacks. 1,200 people. That's a lot of people. And it's mostly been non-citizens. And by and large, the charges against these people are that they had minor visa violations. They did something like they came on a student visa and they worked, or they overstayed a tourist visa. But they're being held in connection with the investigation. And the government isn't releasing even basic information about them, such as their name. There was one person who told me a story. They were listening to Arabic language radio. And it was about a month after the attacks. And some person called up to the radio and said, you know, on September 11th, so-and-so, who was a family member, just disappeared. We didn't hear from him for a whole month. And then all of a sudden, he showed up at the house. Where were you? I was detained. You know, this is the United States. We don't secretly detain people here. I mean, there ought to be some openness, and to do it with a little more openness, I don't think would harm our national security at all. I know, for example, the Attorney General said, look, I don't want to give Osama bin Laden a list of the people who are his operatives who we've detained. Look, if it's one of his operatives and it's 6 months down the road, he knows that that person hasn't been in touch.
Where should this, you know, in the checks and balances we've been discussing, where should this one be checked?
I think that we've had a tradition, and in criminal cases, there's no question about it, of making it clear to everybody when the government has arrested someone and is detaining someone.
But what I'm asking you is, who can tell the Justice Department to do just that?
Only a court. And we've taken this case to court. We filed an appeal of the denial of our Freedom of Information Act request. And we and other civil rights and civil liberties groups are seeking exactly this information.
Look, these detentions are not done frivolously. They're done with proper legal authority. And given the severity of the threat that we felt and perceived after the attacks of September 11, we believe this was the appropriate course of action. And that's what the Attorney General is doing.
And again, what we're talking about is the secrecy part of it.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, I'm Brista Whitmer from Alaska. Do you think that the Supreme Court has had a fair voice in the laws that have been passed since September 11th concerning civil liberties?
Well, that review takes some time as well.
Yes, right. Yes. There are, I think, a handful of provisions in the USA Patriot Act that will probably be tested all the way to the Supreme Court level. Most of what is going on is really not going to be challengeable in court. Some of it will be, and some of it will someday reach the Supreme Court.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Pam Scannell from Michigan. I was wondering, I know they have the metal detectors in the airport and everything, but what happens if someone has a plastic weapon? What do you think we should do to prevent that?
Are you asking about what the technology we have to detect that type of device is?
What do you mean? Do you mean like
a plastic, like I know they're making plastic guns now and like plastic knives that can penetrate the skin and kill someone.
There's no straightforward answer. Obviously, if it's plastic, the metal detector isn't going to set it off. But the metal detector, it will not set off the metal detector. The metal detector is not the only element of the system that we're putting in place to secure air travel. And there are other elements. Part of it is looking at who you want to search physically and performing those searches. We're also putting federal air marshals on aircraft to protect those aircraft. We're hardening the cockpit doors. So there's a lot of activity going on, and so it's not just the metal detector that you need to look at when you think about the security of the air travel system.
Can I introduce a topic I think you've written on, Rich, and we haven't discussed yet, but is a big part of the whole issue, and that's biohazards. I mean, to what degree of threat do you think the American population is under from terrorist attack and that kind of activity?
Well, what we know is the potential consequences of a biological weapons attack could be catastrophic. They might not be. There's an enormous range in what could happen in any particular sort of attack. We suffered the first major attack in October with the 3 letters containing anthrax powder. And what we learned from that is that even a relatively small attack, if it's using proper sort of agent for weapons purposes can cause enormous damage to the infrastructure. There were a number of casualties. There are scenarios involving biological weapons that with much, much higher numbers of casualties and far greater damage to our infrastructure. In this case, what happened is the mail system was damaged badly, and then the office buildings that were detected had to be evacuated and then decontaminated. It is a very serious threat. The perpetrator of the anthrax attack from October, the letters, we presume still at large, is out there. And we know that this is a technology that is accessible to increasing numbers of people, including the terrorists that we worry about.
Hi, go ahead, please.
Hi, my name is Ben. I'm from Seattle. And earlier you were talking about the security with like the new x-ray machines and everything. And I was wondering, to what extent is security going to get to? Like, is it going to be like a full body search of every person, or is it going to like be more border patrol and more like outside patrol, and then have like the security like be a little bit less in airports? Or
You mean you got in here today without a full body search? How did this happen?
I don't know where it's going to end. I really don't. And you know, it's funny. We had this attack at probably, I don't know if it's the best or the worst time technologically. We have all these new gadgets out there, all these new things. There's machines that can look at that wall and figure out whether there's a person behind it and show an outline of the person because they give off infrared light. And we have all these new technologies, and a lot of them are very invasive. A lot of them show a lot more than most people would want to have to show in order to enter a building or get on an airplane. And so we're at a very difficult time, and yet there are other technologies, and I mentioned one earlier, that aren't so invasive and that hold some promise to make us safer, but not less free and to not invade privacy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Simpson from Wasilla, Alaska, and I was wondering what your views are on Ashcroft's proposal for immigration. In it, he asks for the power to detain immigrants for an unlimited amount of time during a national security or a national emergency, and to deport any immigrant posing a threat to national security. Do you believe that this is too much of an invasion on that person, or that this is justified?
We're going to have a difference of opinion on that one. The statute that deals with immigrants or with people who are not citizens or permanent residents is very permissive in terms of what can be done, and it's under that statute that these detentions are taking place. We know that the biggest internal threat we face is not people who have permanent resident cards. Green cards are not U.S. citizens. It's temporary foreign visitors, many of whom have come in on short sort of visitor visas or overstayed. Some have come on student visas, never gone to school, changed their major into something else, or overstayed their visas. And that is just, we look out there and figure out what is our greatest internal threat. That's where it is. It's not everyone. The vast majority of those people pose no threat whatsoever to America, but a very small number of them do, and a very small number of people can cause catastrophic damage against our country, and we don't want to allow that.
The Attorney General asked for exactly the power that you described. That was in his original bill, and Congress said no. What Congress said was that we'll allow you to certify people who you think are terrorists, and you can detain them for up to 7 days. But at that time, on that 7th day, week, you got to either charge them with an immigration violation or charge them with a criminal violation. Now, the Supreme Court has said that it's 2 days. For people who are citizens, and the government wants to arrest you and accuse you of a crime, they have 2 days to get you in front of a judge and to say you're charged with so-and-so and such and such. So you could be held for, the weekend. I don't know whether the 7-day rule will ever make it to the Supreme Court, but I do know this. The Attorney General's request for the power to indefinitely detain people without charge was properly rejected by Congress.
George, we only have about 10 seconds for you to tell us about Part 3 in our series. What will we be talking about?
Well, we're going to carry on with something you mentioned earlier, and we were all talking about, and that's tolerance. We'll have a kind of a town meeting, if you will, with students and others, and talk about how the society gets to be what it should be.
Where do we
in
go
terms of
from here?
tolerance.
Okay,
Exactly.
thank you. I want to thank Richard Falkenrath and Gregory Nojeim for joining us. And gentlemen, while there's built-in tension to the issues we're talking about here, I think we all appreciate that in both cases you're working to protect us, and we appreciate that.
Absolutely.
Thanks very
we
much.
need you both.
Yeah. Thanks to all of you as well. Hope you enjoy the rest of your time here in Washington on the Close-Up program. And to those of you joining us on C-SPAN, we will return next week with a discussion on education policy and priorities. Thanks for watching. Who was next in line? Last in line. Was that this gentleman here? Our tradition is if you didn't get to ask your question on the air, but you were next in line, we'll entertain